Thus, the object in its pure determinateness, or in the determinateness which were supposed to constitute its essential being, is overcome just as surely as it was in its sensuous being. From a sensuous being, it turned into a universal. But this universal, since it originates in the sensuous, is essentially conditioned by it, and hence is not truly a self-identical universality at all, but one afflicted with an opposition. For this reason, the universality splits into the extremes of singular individuality and universality into the one of the properties and the also of the free matters. These pure determinatenesses seem to express the essential nature itself, but they are only a being for self that is burdened with a being for another. Since, however, both are essentially in a single unity, what we now have is unconditioned absolute universality, and consciousness here for the first time truly enters the realm of the understanding. You'll notice now that in section 129 and in 130, Hegel is going to speak of the understanding. And we'll come back to that in a moment. What I would caution you from right at the very beginning is automatically reading into that term all the Kantian baggage that people tend to associate with it, because Hegel was not just a reader of Kant, but of many other philosophers who use that term understanding or intellect. And we'll come back to that in a moment. But let's start with what's going on in this particular section. So we're kind of picking up the pieces at this point and seeing what we can do to put Humpty Dumpty of the thing back together again, aren't we? So he says, the object in its pure determinatenesses, notice the plural there, in its pure determinacies, we might say, its ways of being determined, which are multiple. Not just one single determinateness, but multiple determinatenesses that somehow have to be coordinated within the scope of the object in relation to other objects for the perceiving consciousness. It says, these are supposed to constitute its essential being, right? So we've got these properties, these free matters, these determinatenesses. That's supposed to be what the object really is about when we're perceiving it. That's what we started with. That's what we've been working our way through. That's where Hegel's starting here. He says, the object in these we're supposed to constitute its essential being is overcome just as surely as it was in its sensuous being. So a similar process is happening here in perception as happened towards the end of sense certainty. We've realized that the object of sense certainty, the immediacy of it, didn't turn out to be like that. You know, we went through the whole dialectic of the here, the there, the then, the now, you know, time, space, universals, all those sorts of things. So he says, from a sensuous being, it turned into a universal. But this universal, since it originates in the sensuous, since it's coming about through our processes of perceiving, of experiencing, remains, as he's going to say, conditioned by it. So, you know, this is something worth pausing about for a minute. When we think about our perceptions of things, does this ring true with us? Do we get our conceptions of universals, at least the universals that pertain to the perceiving, you know, the world that we engage in, do we get those in part through our perception of things, and does that condition them? Well, you know, let's think about, as we've done so long, chalk, right? Is this the only way that chalk can look, or is the aspect of chalk for you and I, because we live in an age of mass-produced mechanical reproduction, is our sense of chalk a little bit different than it might be for ancient Romans, who also had blackboards with smaller ones, and who also had wax tablets, right? That would be a good example right there, actually, of a thing, you know, having its determinacy in part in relation to its other, that it's like, but isn't the same thing as. We don't write on wax tablets. We don't use Etch-a-Sketches, at least, you know, those of us who aren't, you know, playing around with them as kids. But we do use chalk, but we also use, say, whiteboards. That would be our point of comparison there. Our universals that we're using for a piece of chalk or chalkboard are conditioned by the sensuous manifold that we work within. We are situated, you might say. Hegel is noting this. This is, by the way, one of those places where everyone says, Hegel's so abstract, he doesn't take account of the individual particular. He does, in fact, but he sees that as part of the problem. So he goes on and he says, it's not truly a self-identical universality at all, but one afflicted with opposition. It splits. It is afflicted with a tendency to shatter into two sides. A side of universality and a side of singular individuality. Now, I have placed these above the one and the also, but I don't want you to think just because I put them there on the chalkboard, you've got, only so much room here, that they are necessarily connected in that way. There's no reason to think that the one with its properties is necessarily the universality and not actually the singular individuality that Hegel's talking about here. We could productively read it either way, where either the one or the also can take on either of these aspects because there's so much slippage here in terms of the universality. So he says we have these extremes, singular universality, individuality and universality, the one of the properties, the also of the free matters. We've seen that, we not only can see the thing in these different ways, but we're stuck seeing the thing in these different ways, and we can't seem to unify them. We can't seem to shove them all in the same semantical or conceptual shoebox and put an end to it, can we? So he says, these pure determinatenesses seem to express the essential nature itself, right? But, and here's where we have a transition, they are only a being for self that is burdened with a being for another. And we've seen this interplay just in the last couple paragraphs with this chiastic structure. A thing is for itself insofar as it is for another, and is for another insofar as it is for itself. It cannot separate these two aspects apart from each other. They are different from each other, but yet they're also in a unity. But I want to stay here for just a moment and linger over this language. Burdened. The being for self can't get away from being for another. It would love to. And consciousness, skipping ahead to the next paragraph, consciousness would love for it to be nice and simple like that, but it isn't. Universality. We would love if universality could just be exactly what we want it to be and what we pretend it to be. But at this stage, it's not that. Remember how we just talked in the last video about Notwendigkeit, necessity, in a certain way being you don't get what you want, you get what there is, and you're stuck with it, so you better figure out what to do with it? That's the same thing that's going on right here. Hegel's not saying it in those terms, but you could easily read that in. Now let's follow this out. So there is a unity between these two, right? Being for itself and being for another. Where are they unified? In the object, in the thing, in its relation to other things. So what does that mean? Hegel says, since they are essentially in a single unity, what we have now is unconditioned, absolute universality. Doesn't that sound great? Absolute, unconditioned universality. You can't get any better than that. It's not going to actually turn out to be so, but at least it appears so for the moment. But now, absolute unconditioned universality for what? For the faculty of the understanding. Or, if you like, the faculty of the intellect. That which takes in the sensible and makes sense of it. Sense beyond the sense available from a purely sensuous position, that extracts concepts out of it, that carries out generalization, that operates upon it, and eventually, when we get to Kant, has an entire manifold, the categories of the understanding, which it imposes upon the content. But even if we take Kant out of the picture, and we just stick, say, with the British empiricists or some of the earlier rationalists that focus on the intellect or the understanding, what's the upshot of this? Perception now is sensuous, but what's being extracted from it is something that's supposed to be an unconditioned, absolute universality. You might think about Descartes and meditation 2 and his thought experiment and physical experiment with the wax. What is actually going on there? That's the understanding, trying to figure out what is this wax. And he comes up with, well, it's really just, extended substance. That's all I can really make of it. So we're going from this play with the object for perception, for the perceiver, for consciousness. And now consciousness is learning something about itself. We've seen consciousness learn something about itself previously when it dealt with, in this section, itself being an also, a medium that took in things through the various senses and then somehow united them together in an object. What's doing that? Is it the common sense, or is it instead the understanding? And is the understanding thereby converting the sensuous into absolute universality and overcoming this split? Thus, the singular being of sense does indeed vanish in the dialectical movement of immediate certainty and becomes universality, but it is only a sensuous universality. My meaning has vanished and perception takes the object as it is in itself or as a universal as such. Singular being therefore emerges in the object as true singleness, as the in itself out of the one, or as a reflectedness into self. But this is still a conditioned being for self, alongside which appears another being for self, the universality which is opposed to and conditioned by a singular being. But these two contradictory extremes are not merely alongside each other, but in a single unity, or in other words, the defining characteristic common to both, that is, being for self, is burdened with opposition generally. That is, it is at the same time not a being for self. The sophistry of perception seeks to save these moments from their contradiction, and it seeks to lay hold on the truth by distinguishing between the aspects, by sticking to the also and to the insofar, and finally by distinguishing the unessential aspect from an essence which is opposed to it. But these expedients, instead of warding off deception in the process of apprehension, prove themselves, on the contrary, to be quite empty, and the truth which is supposed to be won by this logic of the perceptual process proves to be, in one and the same respect, the opposite of itself, and thus to have as its essence a universality which is devoid of distinctions and determinateness. Section 130 might be titled The Sophistry of Perception, or it might be titled You Can't Have Your Cake and Eat It Too, and You Can't Even Have That. How are we going to get there? Well, we see him talking about the singular being of sense, and it vanishes, he says, or gives way to universality, which is then taken in by perception, right? But this is a sensuous universality, and we've seen some of the problems with that. But a lot of the problems are actually below the surface. Right here, it looks like, finally, we're getting something that we can latch onto. It's the universal, just like we were finishing up with in sense certainty. Maybe we've traversed the same path, just in a more sophisticated way at a higher level. Maybe now we're ready to move into something else. Hegel always has a surprise for you. Here's how he says it. My meaning, that is the Meinung, the intending, the singular, has vanished because I no longer can talk or focus on the singular being of sense, because as it turns out, it's not there. There isn't anything to really grasp like that. It always turns out to be harnessed and to be condensed into this universality. Perception can grasp that. Perception takes the object in itself, in its determinate mode of being, how it is. It grasps it as itself. He says a universal as such. So what happens then? Singular being therefore emerges in the object as true singleness. Singular being emerges in the object of perception as true singleness, which is actually to be a universal. The universal is what really is single, unified. So he goes on and he says, the in itself of the one or a reflectedness into self. But this is still a conditioned being for self, alongside which appears another being for self. So what we have here is we think this is what we're getting, and actually instead, I should put two arrows, this is what we get instead. What's above the board isn't really what's below the board, and what's below the board is what matters. And now we have this whole complex where we have two being for selves. The being for self of the unity, or the singularity, the singular thing that allows it to be a singular thing. And now it's not just opposed to another singular thing, it's opposed to the universal itself that makes sense out of what it actually is. So this piece of chalk becomes opposed to the for itself of the universality chalkness, chalkity, whatever we want to call it. And what does that mean? That means that it's burdened again, like we saw in the previous passage. There's a splitting that's taking place here. There's an opposition that it cannot extricate and free itself of. This turned out to be a mirage. So he goes on and he says, it's a conditioned being for itself, alongside which appears another being for itself, the universality which is opposed to and conditioned by singular being. We know the chalkness through the chalk. We know the chalk through chalkness. Both of them condition each other. Neither one of them is where the entirety of what's going on lies, no matter how badly perception wants that to be the case. So here's where he is going to say, these two contradictory extremes are not merely alongside each other, but also in a single unity. And what is that single unity? It lies in the fact that being for self is not being for self, and not being for self is being for self. These things are unified in relation to each other. So he says, being for self is burdened with opposition. At the same time, it's a not being for self. That doesn't mean that it stops being for self, but it means that it also is not what it is. I know that sounds rather tricky, so I'm going to say it one more time so you can wrap your head around it. Being for self, the relation to itself that makes it the kind of object that it is at the same time a not being for itself, not what it is. The relation itself to self is not what it is not what can constitute the thing as being this perfect, finished, sensuous universality that was supposed to represent the singular being of sense. Hopefully that makes sense. So he calls this the sophistry of perception. And what is sophistry? Sophistry has a long history with philosophy as a discipline. Sophistry, Plato identified as not being what it pretended to be. In a certain way, sophistry, its being for self, its self-understanding of what it was doing, doesn't turn out to be the way that it is. All you need to do is read the Republic, Book 1, or Gorgias, or several of the other dialogues to figure that out, right? Because they can't actually stand up to the dialectic that Plato brings to bear on them. When we talk about sophistry, we mean something that passes for wisdom, but can't actually hold its position when it's being challenged. It has to shift its ground over and over and over again. That's what Hegel describes happening here. I'm not going to put all the other stuff up on the board because there's too many different distinctions to talk about. And you can go back, you can read back through the previous passages, the previous paragraphs, and see exactly what he's talking about here. We started out with, talking about these aspects, sticking to the also and the insofar. Finally, by distinguishing between the unessential aspect from an essence which is opposed to it. Then he says these expedients, instead of warding off deception in the process of apprehension, instead of allowing perception to say, I've purified myself of all this detritus that was getting me confused or leading me astray before, it's just showing that perception doesn't actually know quite what it's doing. He says, these expedients prove themselves, on the contrary, to be quite empty. So what do we get? We drive from this over here to having some sort of essence. But it's an essence that's lacking distinctions, Unterschied, and determination, Bestimmtheit. Exactly the sort of things that we need in order to make sense out of this, right? So what good is this essence that lacks distinctions and determinateness? It's not very good at all, and as it's going to turn out, it's not really even an essence. But that's what the sophistry of perception, the sophistry, as we're going to see, of good old common sense, is going to lead us into, according to Hegel. These empty abstractions of a singleness and universality opposed to it, and of an essence that is linked with something unessential, a non-essential aspect which is necessary all the same, these are powers whose interplay is the perceptual understanding, often called sound common sense. This sound common sense, which takes itself to be a solid, realistic consciousness, is in the perceptual process only the play of these abstractions. Generally, it is always at its poorest where it fancies itself to be the richest. Bandied about by these vacuous essences thrown into the arms first of one and then of the other, and striving by its sophistry to hold fast and affirm alternately first one of these essences and then the directly opposite one, it sets itself against the truth and holds the opinion that philosophy is concerned only with mental entities. As a matter of fact, philosophy does have to do with them too, recognizing them as the pure essences, the absolute elements and powers, but in doing so recognizes them in their specific determinateness as well, and is therefore master over them, whereas perceptual understanding, or sound common sense, takes them for the truth and is led on by them from one error to another. It does not itself become conscious that it is simple essentialities of this kind that hold sway over it, but fancies that it has always to do with wholly substantial material and content, just as sense certainty is unaware that the empty abstraction of pure being is its essence. But it is, in fact, these essentialities within which perceptual understanding runs to and fro through every kind of material and content. They are the cohesive power and mastery over that content, and they alone are what the sensuous is as essence for consciousness. They are what determines the relations of the sensuous to it, and it is in them that the process of perception and of its truth runs its course. This course of perpetual alternation of determining what is true and then setting aside this determining constitutes, strictly speaking, the steady everyday life and activity of perceptual consciousness, a consciousness which fancies itself to be moving in the realm of truth. It advances uninterruptedly to the outcome in which all these essentialities or determinations are equally set aside, but in each single moment it is conscious only of this one determinateness as the truth, and then in turn of the opposite one. It does indeed suspect their unessentiality, and to save them from the danger threatening them, it resorts to the sophistry of asserting to be true what it has itself just declared to be untrue. What the nature of these untrue essences is really trying to get perceptual understanding to do is to bring together and thereby supersede the thoughts of these non-entities, the thoughts of that universality and singular being, of also and one, of the essentiality that is necessarily linked to the unessential moment, and of an unessential moment that yet is necessary. But the understanding struggles to avoid doing this by resorting to insofar as and to the various aspects, or by making itself responsible for one thought in order to keep the other one isolated as the true one. But the very nature of these abstractions brings them together of their own accord. It is sound common sense that is the prey of these abstractions, which spin it round and round in their whirling circle. When common sense tries to make them true by at one time making itself responsible for their untruth, while at another time it calls their deceptiveness a semblance of the unreliability of things and separates what is essential from what is necessary to them, yet supposedly unessential, holding the former to be their truth as against the latter, when it does this, it does not secure them their truth, but convicts itself of untruth. With this quite long paragraph, section 131, Hegel is bringing the section perception to a close. Now, the length of this is a little bit deceptive. There's perhaps, you might say, a bit less going on there than the length might suggest, but he's bringing everything together, and he's convicting a way of thinking about things of its insufficiency, of its sophistry, of its inadequacy. And what he's going to be bashing here is what he calls the perceptual understanding, or as many people are going to call it, sound common sense. Now, what's he going on about with all this? Let's take a look at what he says. There's all these, as he calls, empty abstractions. Singleness, universality that's opposed to an essence, that's linked with something unessential, a non-essential aspect was necessary, all the same. He says, these are powers whose interplay is the perceptual understanding. And this sound common sense takes itself, as he says, to be something solid, something that is getting to the heart of things, that is grasping reality as it truly is. So he says what's really going on, though, is it's just a play of those abstractions. It's always at its poorest where it fancies itself the richest. So perceptual understanding thinks that it is grasping what's going on here in the sensuous particular things, and really all it's getting hold of are these categories over here, or particularizations of them. But in any case, it treats them as abstract. It does not grasp them as they are, and it thinks that it's grasping their essence when really it's not. So he says, bandied about by these vacuous essences. There's this constant interplay where perceptual understanding is not getting what it really desires, or you might say that the person, the consciousness, is not getting what he or she desires through the perceptual understanding. So perceptual understanding is going to say, well, how about this? Well, okay, not that. How about this over here? Sort of like a shop clerk that can't give you the right product. And they just keep up a pattern, going back and forth, suggesting different alternatives. So he says, as a matter of fact, you know, what's going to happen here is philosophy is going to be seen by good old common sense as only dealing with these mental entities, only dealing with these abstractions. And Hegel says, you know what? That's actually partly right, because a dialectical philosophy, a genuine philosophy, would be dealing with them, but it would be dealing with them in a very different way. This philosophy, a philosophy of the understanding, as Hegel is going to call it in so many other places, will take its cues from these and allow these to dominate it. It will not attempt to impose some sort of structure upon it. This is one way in which you can say this is very unkantian, because the Kantian understanding, as we know, imposes categories, right? But those categories are pretty fixed. In a Hegelian dialectical system, philosophy takes these and masters them. It makes them its own, and it places them in the proper relation which it has between that and the sensuous particular things, which we saw condition the universals, condition the essences, and in turn are conditioned by them. So it treats them as determinate essences, not just as abstract essences. If we go on a little bit further, he's coming back to this complaint that he has. He says that the perceptual understanding runs to and fro through every kind of material and content in these essentialities. So it's trying to grasp this object, that object, this object, that object, trying to make sense out of all of them. But he says they are the cohesive power and mastery over that content. They alone are what the sensuous is as an essence for consciousness. They are what determines the relations of the sensuous to it, and it is in them that the process of perception and of its truth runs its course. The problem is, this is a perpetual, he says, alternation of determining what is true and then setting aside this determining. So it can never find a fixed point to settle down on, even though it promises us and promises itself that it is indeed finding these fixed points. If Hegel is right, then any what he calls philosophy of the understanding is always going to be an incomplete philosophical perspective. It will appear for a while as if it's taking everything in, whether it's a Cartesian philosophy or a Humean philosophy or even a Kantian philosophy to a certain extent, you know, what some of the neo-Kantians made of Kant when they took a more positivist turn with that. But it's never going to deliver us what we actually want from philosophy, which is in part to understand what the hell is going on between these and how does consciousness actually take all of these in together. So he says, you know, what happens is that the understanding struggles to avoid bringing all these together in some sort of coherent way by resorting to the insofar as and to the various aspects, or making it responsible for one thought in order to keep the other one isolated as the true one. But, he says, the very nature of these abstractions brings them together of their own accord. Now, what does that mean? These sorts of determinations, when we actually let them do what they want to do, when we allow them to develop dialectically, they show us their connections to each other. That's why we can do a phenomenology of this. That's why we're not stuck with a philosophy of the understanding. That's why we can observe as conscious beings the process through which this occurs, because they have a sort of agency to them. They develop in relation to each other. Only an adequate philosophy is going to grasp that. Sound common sense, he says, is the prey of these abstractions which spin it round and round in their whirling circle. When common sense tries to make them true by at one time making itself responsible for their untruth, when it says, I will take the untruth on to me and say there's no untruth in there, then they turn around and they show that there's actually some untruth there. Another time it calls their deceptiveness a semblance of the unreliability of things. And if that's the case, then sound common sense isn't going to make any progress either. So what we have here is a kind of impasse, or aporia, and not being able to go further. But the reason we can't go further is because we're relying on this. Now, could it be that this isn't fully understood, that the relation to itself has not been developed fully, and that this could be more than just sound common sense? That's what we're going to see tackled in the next section, which is called Force and the Understanding. But that's going to require a shift of perspective to take place, which is going to lead us into this.